Well, good afternoon, good morning, everybody from different parts of the country. My name is David Coletto. Welcome back to what is our fifth weekly briefing during this 44th Canadian general election. We've got 4 days left, depending on how you're feeling. If you're like me, that's a good thing. This campaign, although a short one, has felt quite long, and I am as you can say, excited that we're coming down to the end. But I am excited to be here and share the latest research that we've been doing. Something new this week. I'm going to have numbers from the typical weekly survey we do that's conducted over the weekend. But on Monday, we started doing about 500 interviews a night. And so we're now doing daily tracking. So I've got the first results of that polling that was finished yesterday evening. So as fresh in numbers as you can really get. So welcome to everybody on the call today. And as always, if there are questions at the end or even during my presentation, just use the chat or Q&A function and I will address them. So let's get into it. So what are the takeaways for this week's briefing? On one side of it, if you look at all the briefings I've done over the last few weeks, you can kind of summarize them to say that after the first week and a half, nothing has really changed. But I think that underneath what has been a very close race, there has been some movement in terms of underlying perceptions and impressions. The four takeaways for me this week are, the race is still close, but even in the past week, I think there's some indication and evidence that the Liberals likely have the upper hand right now because of the strength that they are showing in Ontario and Quebec. I'll show you that, and I'll show you what it means in terms of potential seats. The result has been that the Conservatives seem stuck and they're losing some ground to the People's Party. So, some polls had them ahead. We at one point had them ahead of the Liberals. They've fallen behind now, and it does feel like they've lost any momentum and are really not able to break through the low 30s that they've kind of hit over the past few weeks. Now, one of the interesting things in this campaign so far, and if you recall in previous briefings, I've talked about the Liberal NDP switchers, the possibility that New Democrat supporters might vote strategically. We actually don't see that happening yet. If it is going to happen, there's only 4 days left for that movement to occur. But the New Democrat vote seems to be holding fairly strong. And because of the sort of the leakage from the Conservatives to the People's Party, that hasn't yet hurt the Liberals. So because both of the main parties are kind of losing votes to the left for the Liberals and then to the right for the Conservatives, it's leaving them in the same place, which is a Liberal advantage. But the big unknown that is hard for pollsters like me to really gauge, but we can anticipate and try to think of the scenarios at play is, what is voter turnout going to be? We know a few things. We know that about 1.1 million mail ballots have been requested from Elections Canada. About, I think, 600,000 to 700,000 of those may now have been returned. So a lot of votes could come in, almost 5 to 6%, say, of those who voted last time, if we use those numbers, could have voted by mail. And then we also know that over the past weekend, advance polling was open and more people voted in advance polls than did in 2019, about a 20 point increase. So that could signal high turnout, but it also could signal just that people are changing the way that they vote. Over the last few elections, both provincially and federally, we have seen higher early voting that hasn't necessarily led into higher overall turnout. So I don't necessarily think it's predictive, but it does suggest, even today, I would say close to 40% or more of the ballots have already been casted that are going to be put into this election. And so a lot of what happens over the next 4 days may not have has as big an impact as it might have had in the past when fewer people would have voted early. So turnout, though, is important. So let's get into the numbers. We've got the Liberals opening up a slight lead over the Conservatives. And so this now represents those who say they have either voted already or they say are definitely going to vote. Over this week, I'm really honing in on those two groups, because over time, if you're saying to me, I'm not going to vote, or it's really unlikely, then we really don't need to know how they might vote, because they're not going to show up. So if we're trying to understand the outcome of this election, I think these two groups are critical. And so we've got the Liberals slightly ahead by 2 points over the Conservatives. The New Democrats are at 22, the Bloc at 5 nationally, the People's Party at 5, and the Greens at 3. And compared to the final poll, the previous poll we did on Sunday, the Liberals are up slightly, the Conservatives are down slightly, but look, the New Democrats are up 3. So we'll see if that trend continues for the New Democrats. We're going to have daily numbers out every night around 5 o'clock. So you can go to our website, follow me on Twitter, and you can get these daily numbers every evening, just as you're either finishing your day or about to, have dinner. I'm sure, it's a nice shot of political intelligence for you right at the end of the day. But these national numbers, this close race still, but an advantage for the Liberals, really is masking still what is a Liberal advantage at the regional level. Now in British Columbia, we're seeing the Liberals doing a little bit less well than they have in previous polls. It's still close between the Conservatives and the NDP. Smaller sample sizes in all of these smaller provinces or regions, BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. Hard to get a precise read when you're only interviewing like 160, 180 people. But the general direction is that the Conservatives continue to do well in the prairies. It's a tight, close race in BC. But look at Ontario and Quebec. We've got larger samples in those two provinces, so we have a much better view of what's happening. And in Quebec, we've got the Liberals ahead of the Bloc by 9. The Bloc number's down. It's the lowest we've had it. We'll see whether that continues. But a 9-point lead for the Liberals is a strong place, much better than they did last time, would allow them to sort of go up the middle in many seats in different parts of the province. In Ontario, they're ahead by 6, which is slightly lower than they were in the last election, but still a good enough lead that might hold their kind of fortress around the Greater Toronto area. and in other parts of the province, like in London and in Ottawa. And then in Atlantic Canada, we've got the Liberals doing substantially doing well, ahead by a lot. So regionally, really where the race is in Ontario and Quebec is giving the Liberals their advantage. Now, a few interesting storylines. What's going on below, these national numbers even more? Well, here's the vote by age. And you can see consistently, I've shown you that the New Democrats and the Liberals are doing better with younger voters under 30. The Conservatives, you can see, are at now 10 points ahead among those 60 and over. That's a signal perhaps that turnout will matter more. But the Liberal vote is fairly consistent across different age groups. The NDP does substantially less well among older voters than they do among those most youngest voters. If we add gender into the mix, some interesting dynamics. The Conservatives are doing much better among men generally. The Liberals doing much better among women generally, but younger men and older men are actually quite different. Younger men are solidly in the Conservative camp. Older men, are solidly in the Conservative camp. The Conservatives lead the Liberals by 20 points among men over 45, but among younger men, the Liberals are ahead by almost 10 points, with the New Democrats doing well there. Among female voters, the Liberals are ahead by both groups, but substantially so among younger women. So you can see the dynamics that, if younger voters, particularly younger women, are so critical to the Liberal success in this election, that they need to come out and vote, which is why issues like childcare, housing, affordability issues that relate to women, getting women back in the workforce, that's a key theme of the Liberal campaign, and something I think that is resonating with those women under 45. I also showed you the results based on whether somebody has used CERB, the pandemic benefits that the federal government rolled out. Interestingly, among those who have used it, the Conservative vote drops to 23%. The Liberals and the NDP are pretty competitive. And then among those who haven't, you can see that NDP vote drop. Now, part of that is demographics. Those who have relied on CERB at some point are typically younger. They're typically female. They work in hospitality, tourism, retail, those hardest hit sectors. And so that's not surprising, but I thought I'd share it because I thought it was an interesting dynamic. And then lastly, looking at the urban-rural split, if this election happened only in rural Canada, the Conservatives would easily win a majority government. They're ahead by the Liberals by 13. In urban Canada, the Liberals would easily win. And you can see how competitive it is between the Liberals and the Conservatives in suburban Canada. That's that GTA, the lower mainland, suburban Montreal, suburban Edmonton, suburban Calgary. These are the real battlegrounds, particularly outside of Alberta, that the two parties are fighting over, and it's still very close between them. And I gave you that already. So what does the poll tracker say? If we take all the polls, and there's been at least a dozen in the last few days, they're showing a similar story. So the Liberals slightly ahead of the Conservatives. The New Democrats are at around 20, the Bloc around 6.5, the People's Party around 6, and the Greens at 3.5. And that column on the right just shows you how the poll average compares to our most recent survey. And so for the most part, except maybe for the New Democrats, we're in the range of what we would expect given the margin of error. So we are seeing a slightly higher NDP number, but again, our poll is really new. And so maybe that's an indication of some gains for the New Democrats, something we're going to watch closely. What does this mean for seats? Well, there's a number of different models, but they're all kind of pointing clearly to a Liberal minority. 150 or so seats for the Liberals, 120 for the Conservatives, 36 for the New Democrats, 30 for the Bloc. And you can see when we compare that projection with where things were at the end of 2019, pretty much the same, other than the New Democrats winning 12 more seats and everybody else losing a little bit. The makeup of our parliament will, if these numbers were to hold and sort of break out the way we think they will, be very similar to what we see when this election was called. So could be that we have gone through this whole process, spent all this money and time and effort, and we get the same outcome. Although I think there will be consequences of that, whether the Prime Minister sticks around, whether Mr. O'Toole gets another shot, lots of political implications. But in terms of government and policy, this doesn't suggest a significant shift in the way, in the potential agendas of our parliament. In fact, the increased representation from the New Democrats could change that calculus slightly, but it would suggest that either the Bloc or the New Democrats could hold the balance of power. So the Liberals would have two partners in this scenario in which to sort of find common ground on different issues. So, we're a few days from the campaign, and I have been, in talking to folks and talking to friends and family, and then just following this campaign, it does seem that one of the features of this campaign has been that people aren't really that engaged in it. And so I had this question, if a campaign event happens and no one notices, does it happen? Do they happen, right? The leaders' debates, the Quebec Premier endorsing more or less Mr. O'Toole and the Conservatives. All of those things that seemingly should really move the numbers or have in the past haven't. And is it maybe because people just aren't paying attention? So here's some interesting data. When we asked people last week, how interested are they in this campaign? 64% indicated they've got at least some level of a high interest, 7 to 10 on a scale from 0 to 10. Compared to last week, about the same. Compared to last election, it is down. So certainly overall interest in this campaign is down 5 points, which is not huge, but is enough that, that could impact turnout. It could change some of the dynamics of the campaign. But more interestingly, when we ask people, to what extent have you been following news and information about the campaign so far? Only 12% say they're following this election very closely. Another 29 pretty closely. And the majority of the electorate, most Canadians, say, I'm either not paying attention at all, that's a small group, 11, or only a little bit. And so that suggests to me that even in the final week of the campaign, as this final week was starting, a lot of people were just not engaged. But we asked a follow-up question. We said, okay, but over the past week, do you sense yourself getting more interested or paying more attention to what's going on? And we do see some indication that almost half of people say they are getting more interested in this campaign. And importantly, a substantial number of people who said, I'm only paying a little attention or no attention at all, are now paying more attention. And that they represent 16% of the electorate. So these are folks who maybe before this week said, I'm really zoning it out. I was going to wait to the last minute or wait till I really, felt like getting involved. But now I'm getting more interested. I'm paying more attention. Okay, so that's 16%, not huge, but sizable enough that, if they weren't fully engaged and they then become engaged, could impact the vote. So then we look at how are they going to vote, or how they say they're going to vote. 44% of them would vote Liberal, 24 NDP, 23 Conservative. So what does this mean to me? It means if we do see in these final days people starting to come out of their kind of fog and their annoyance with this election being called and start saying, okay, well, I'm going to vote, and I now need to figure out who am I going to vote for, that early indications are that perhaps that benefits the Liberals, that they might be in place to see a rise in the final days of the campaign. This isn't necessarily predictive, but I'm trying to find some evidence and give you some sense of what might be happening. And to me, this is an interesting indicator that particularly younger voters, those that may not be normally interested in politics, if they start to sort of get a little bit of an election engagement going, realizing that election day is coming, that it could benefit the Liberals if they were to vote. Now, we did have 2 debates last week. It seems like forever ago that they happened. So just quickly, I wanted to share with you what we learned about how they reacted to them. So I'm going to focus only on the English debate, but the French language debates show similar types of results. When we asked people across the country, whether they watched or whether they heard anything about that English language debate, 14% across the country said they watched it all. The blue bar is those who speak English. So just to look at Anglophones only, not a big difference between the national average. Some Francophones watched the English debate. Another quarter said they watched some of it. And then another about quarter said they heard something. 1 out of 3 Canadians said, I heard nothing, didn't pay attention, don't know what happened. This is lower than it was in 2019. So this debate, if you watched it, there's lots of debate about the debate itself and its format. But it wasn't an event in which millions and millions and millions of Canadians tuned in. Sizable number did, but certainly lower than it was in 2019. So when we ask people, based on what you saw or heard, do you think each of these leaders made a positive impression or a negative impression or no impression on you? And so this is the results. Mr. Singh had half of people saying he left a positive impression. Mr. O'Toole did pretty well. Even Mr. Trudeau had 38%. Mr. Blanchette, the Bloc leader, rarely has much empathy outside of Quebec, and so fewer people thought he did well. But the important thing here is that not a lot of people felt that any of these leaders really did poorly. Higher numbers for Mr. Trudeau, but he's a more polarizing figure anyways. People really don't like him, and so even if he did perform well, they may not be willing to give him the credit for it. But this signals to me that no one really lost this election, and that Jagmeet Singh, like he's done throughout this campaign, impressed a lot of people, but doesn't seem to have moved the numbers. When we ask people which leader did the most to earn your vote, Mr. Trudeau is more or less tied with Mr. O'Toole, with Mr. Singh not far behind. So no one leader kind of blew everybody away and really impressed people who weren't otherwise going to vote for them, which I think is the conclusion I take from these debates, that they reinforced people's views. If you were a conservative tuning in, you probably liked what you heard from Erin O'Toole. You probably didn't like what you heard from Justin Trudeau. And so it didn't change all that much about your views and how you thought about it. Now, again, the debate was messy, and it was, a lot of talking by moderators and journalists. And so it may not have been the right format to actually for people to see a distinction. But when we asked people who did the most to lose your vote, same two at the top, Mr. Trudeau slightly ahead of Mr. O'Toole. And so to me, that signifies, okay, well, Mr. Singh probably had a better night of the three main leaders. Ms. Paul really didn't make much of an impression, although I think she personally did okay. And I think it was an interesting introduction for her. But as we've seen, the Green Party numbers have not moved since these debates. And so the conclusion is that these debates happened. A lot of people tuned in, not as many as usual, and they don't seem to have moved the numbers all that much, right? And so how do we know that? Well, let's look at where the leaders stand. And this is how people view the leaders today in our most recent tracking poll. 42 positive for Trudeau, 47 negative, a little more polarization happening there. Mr. O'Toole's numbers have not moved. And actually, Mr. Singh's numbers are wrong on the screen. It should be 44 positive, 33 negative. I'll show you that in a minute. And then Ms. Paul's numbers, despite being in that debate, haven't moved either. If we look at the progression of Mr. Trudeau's numbers, as I've done last week, he's more or less where he is at the end of the last campaign, -5. So take the positive numbers and you subtract the negative. That's been the same pretty much for both this whole campaign and coming out of the last campaign. For Mr. O'Toole, we've seen a slight increase in his negatives, just a little bit. He's still better off than when he started this campaign, and about where Mr. Scheer was, a little bit better when Mr. Scheer ended the last federal election. So O'Toole, again, despite some early improvement in his numbers, he's held pretty flat since sort of convincing conservative-oriented voters that he was a good guy. He still hasn't been able to convince those outside of that universe to see him in that way. And then lastly, Mr. Singh remains the most popular, +17. It's exactly pretty much where he was at the end of 2019. And so again, goodwill doesn't always mean votes. A recap of issues, nothing's really changed here. No one issue has really emerged out of these over time, more important than others. The cost of living remains really important. Even yesterday, we had new inflation numbers, 4%, highest it's been since 2003, reinforces this number, and I think gets the parties even more focused on it. Voters want to hear about how they're going to make their lives more affordable. Healthcare, climate change, growing the economy, housing affordability, round out the top 5. That's been this way really since day one. Not a lot of change here. As there's also not a lot of change in who people think is the best on these. Cost of living, almost all equal at around 22, 23%. Making housing more affordable. Mr. Trudeau and Singh have a slight advantage, but pretty equal there, right? It's like all the parties have put a lot of effort into communicating their housing policy, their affordability policy, and none of them have really gotten traction to break free, which either suggests their policy isn't that distinctive or interesting enough that's pulling people who wouldn't otherwise vote for these parties, or perhaps people aren't really voting on issues as they often do, and it's much more about personality and emotion and just general orientation. That could be explaining that. On healthcare, still slight advantage for Mr. Trudeau, but nothing to write home about. On climate change, which the Liberals have talked a lot more about this week. Just I think it was 2 days ago, the former BC Green Party leader, who was instrumental in the previous provincial government, endorsed the Liberals and their Liberal climate change plan. So another challenge for the Green Party, and Mr. Trudeau is well ahead on who people think would do the best on that issue. Growing the economy, Mr. O'Toole has a slight advantage over Mr. Trudeau with Mr. Singh well back. These numbers have not moved at all, if you remember from previous briefings. And then lastly, on getting more people vaccinated, Mr. Trudeau still has a big advantage. And this is a really important point now, given for anyone in Alberta and anyone following what's going on in Alberta. Just yesterday, the Premier announced new restrictions on the province. Some restaurants are closing. They're bringing in a vaccine passport, even though he said he would never do that. And the situation there is getting so bad that he says within 3 days, all the ICU beds in the province may be filled. So we're getting to a really anxious and worrying point in Alberta, which you saw today, the Prime Minister saying, if you don't go all in on the pandemic, you get what happens in Alberta, trying to insinuate that Mr. O'Toole and the Conservatives can't be trusted to get us out of this. In the final days of the campaign, if more and more people are focusing on what's going on in Alberta, and if we start to see, we see in Atlantic Canada, the case numbers starting to creep higher and higher than they've ever been, it's deeply worrying, and that anxiety level for people is going up. If that happens, you could see a last minute swing to the Liberals as people decide, instead of a government for the longer term, a government to get us out of this pandemic. And people think the Prime Minister and the Liberals would be better on that. So it's something to watch. What other things will be important? Well, when we ask people, what kind of government do you want? Who do you want? Of the two choices that are most likely to happen, you can see 60% still would prefer a Liberal government. That's about what it was last week. 40% would prefer some kind of Conservative government. Although there's lots of, differences of opinion over whether people want a majority or minority. This is not an election in which people are aching for stability or they want to see one party in charge, because I think they look at the past 2 years and say, actually, that minority parliament hasn't been that bad, which is why we don't know why we're in election. It seems like you guys were working okay together. You were getting things done. There's, it's hard to say what the Prime Minister's tried to do, that Parliament was dysfunctional and not working very well. What's important about this group is, like, what do these Liberal Conservative switchers want, and what do particularly the NDP Liberal switchers want? Almost all of them want a Liberal government over Conservative one, and right now those Liberal switchers are trending towards a Liberal government, and so it'll be interesting to see. New Democrat supporters, interestingly, not surprising, would much prefer a Liberal minority. It gives them that place. I got a great question here asking, it's interesting when you speak about Alberta and the other provinces as situations with COVID continue to worsen. Do you think that could translate in frustration towards Trudeau for calling an election in the first place? I'm going to come to that more, but I think you raise a really good point that I'm going to address for you. But the short answer is, I don't think so. I now think most of that has been baked into how people are feeling. And what will probably trump annoyance and disappointment at calling this election is a much greater fear about how do we solve for it, who's going to be the best to get us out of it, right? So we're really transitioning away from just, you shouldn't have called this election, but we're in an election, and now we have to choose who do we want to lead us forward. And so I just feel that will trump any frustration that especially those swing voters. I'm not talking about, if you're a hardcore Conservative, you're going to be mad at Trudeau no matter what, and you're probably not going to, you're going to vote for the Conservatives even if the pandemic gets really bad. The same is true for hardcore Liberals. It's those voters in the middle who are undecided or open to being persuaded that I just feel would be much more persuaded about a choice being not about punishing or rewarding the Prime Minister, but more about picking who's going to get us out of this mess in the first place. So great question, and I'll explain more of that in a moment. So that's the preference. In terms of who Canadians think are going to win, we have seen a change in the last week. So the polls in the first half of the election showed the Conservatives taking a lead. More and more talk about the possibility the Conservatives can win. In this past few weeks, the Liberals have caught back up. And for a while now, it's been kind of neck and neck. But the narrative still is that if you you're watching my briefing, you know that the Liberals should still win this election. And so more Canadians today now think the Liberals are going to win than they did last week. The Conservative number hasn't moved, and you can see that unsure number has dropped. So, you know, that plays itself in interesting ways. It allows maybe New Democrats to stick with the New Democrats because they're not worried about the Conservatives winning. So that's something to watch, and we're going to continue to because I think it does affect how people vote. I do want to kind of end with that great question that sort of sparked my thinking, but I really think it's something I've been thinking about a lot over the last week, and that is this internal tension that's probably happening, and for people who voted over the weekend, and then people thinking about Monday, who aren't again locked into one choice, that are much more open to, you know, might be open to voting Liberal or Conservative, or might be open to voting Liberal or NDP or Bloc or Conservative, you know, the sort of that group of voters who aren't deeply tied to one party, that inside their mind throughout this campaign, they have been wrestling with this idea that, you know, is this a change election, or is this an unnecessary election? Because the two are really distinct and different, and they affect the outcome and what the outcome means. So I'll give you an example. We've been tracking the desire for change since the beginning. It hasn't really budged up. Among those who are definitely going to vote, it is a little bit higher, but among the general population, it's about where it was in 2019. So still only about half definitely want a change in government. So keep that number in mind. It hasn't risen all that much throughout this campaign. Now, in the last survey we did, we asked voters, respondents, how will the following impact your decision to vote in this election? And we gave them two scenarios. One, the possibility that the Conservatives and Erin O'Toole could win the election and form a government. How will that impact your vote? Will you be more likely to vote Liberal? Will you be more likely to vote Conservative? Or is it not going to impact your vote in either of these directions? And you can see 40% say it's not going to impact my vote, but 37% say they're more likely to vote Liberal if this is the case, versus 25% who say they're more likely to vote Conservative. But look at this Liberal NDP switchers that I've talked about. Among this group, 70% of that, about 20% of the electorate say, if I think the Liberals are going to lose, or the Conservatives are going to win, more importantly, then I'm going to be more likely to vote Liberal. Doesn't mean I will, but I'm going to be pulled in that direction, right? Like that pull into the Liberal orbit kind of thing. Similarly, a third of Liberal Conservative switchers, a third of NDP supporters say that, right? Large numbers of younger voters and those living in the GTA are more likely to say, I'm more likely to vote Liberal than Conservative if this happens. So this is one of those tensions that is affecting a large part of the electorate, is that they don't want to reward the Prime Minister. Erin O'Toole a few days ago called on voters to punish the Liberals for calling this election, right? So that's one shoulder saying punish, punish, punish. But on the other hand, there's a large number of voters who just aren't sure they want the Conservatives to actually be the government. But the consequence of punishing the Liberals means I get a government that I'm not entirely comfortable with, that I don't agree with on, say, climate change, or on social issues like abortion or equality issues, right? There's just this deep uncomfort with some things that the Conservative Party has talked about and some of their MPs believe in, even if Erin O'Toole has tried to move himself off that. So that's certainly there. And when we look deeper at this idea of calling an election, you can see its impact. So what impact did the following have on your decision? The fact that the Prime Minister called this election when he didn't need to. About half of people say it makes them less likely to vote Liberal, right? That the gray bar is those who say it doesn't impact me. Everybody else says, I'm either will not vote Liberal because of this, 16% at the bottom here, makes me much less likely to vote Liberal, 17%, and makes me somewhat less likely. It's colored me, it's annoyed me. It's like, it's harder to do than I would normally do. That's a lot of people. So there's no doubt in my mind that this calling of this election has affected how people are thinking about their choice. But the ultimate decision they have to make is, can they overcome this annoyance, right? Can they get past the fact that, yes, I know this is unnecessary, but I still need to make the choice that's best for me and best for the country. And that is where that change number hasn't come high enough, because while the Conservatives and the New Democrats have been litigating this election call every single time they have. This is an unnecessary election. You called it when there were wildfires in BC. You called it when Afghanistan fell. You called it during the fourth wave of this pandemic, right? To your question earlier. But on the other side, they haven't said, but replace them with me. We are better. They don't deserve to be in government. Because by arguing that this election is unnecessary, you're also saying, well, Prime Minister, you should still be Prime Minister then. And so as an opposition party, that's a nuance that's important, I think, for how voters are coming at this election. And so at this stage, it's a draw because neither have been able to make the claim. Justin Trudeau has not really been able to overcome the impact that calling this election has had on how people see him. And the Conservatives, and to some extent the New Democrats, but more the Conservatives, haven't been able to galvanize people in thinking that now is the time to change the government and replace it with the Conservatives. And so we're left with a stalemate. Now, one other variable to throw in here. In a survey we did on the weekend, we asked people, obviously, how likely they are to vote. And then we look at it across the different parties. And so this is where this X factor of turnout, especially in this election, when fewer people are paying attention, when long lines could be at polling stations. As of on the weekend, we knew that the Conservative vote was more engaged. More of them said they would definitely vote than the Liberals. And so that is a big factor going forward. So what to watch for? What will turnout be? Can the Conservatives make the case for change in the final days of this campaign? If people aren't paying attention, can any party really change things at this point, right? Or if more and more people are starting to pay attention, that could mean we could see some movement in these final days. Will the People's Party spoil a Conservative win? Some polls have them at 8%. We have them at 5%. Somewhere in between is probably the likely outcome. That's 3-4 times what they got in the last election. That's spoiler potentially for the Conservatives. And then lastly, given that we have 1.1 million votes, given that a lot of those votes might be coming from close races in BC, will we actually know the results of this election on Monday night? It may not happen. It may take a few days for us to really know. So when I come back to you next Thursday and I try to give you a briefing on what happened, there's a slight chance we still may not know fully what exactly happened, but we'll have a good sense of whether it's a close Liberal or Conservative minority, or whether it's so close that chaos ensues and we don't really know who's going to form the government coming forward. So that is what I've got for you this week. I hope that helps clarify what has been a murky and I think challenging election to really wrap my head around. But I think the underlying understanding that still there could be surprises, that because a lot of people aren't paying attention and maybe they start to in the last few days. But that my sense is that the status quo will likely win the day because not enough people have been convinced that we need to change the government, and that despite calling an election that nobody wanted, that's not enough reason to defeat the Liberals. It's enough reason to be annoyed with them and disappointed and maybe even angry. But governments have big things to do, and we've got big issues, and so people might overlook that and ultimately choose who they think is best for the job. So I will stop there, and I happily take any questions that folks have on the call. And if not, just a reminder, we'll have daily tracking you can get on our website every day around 5. And I will be here next week at the same time to do a final briefing on a wrap up of what I think happened and what our final poll that we're doing over the weekend, a deep dive, signals to us about what people were thinking when they walked into the ballot box on Monday. So seeing no questions, although maybe I'll give people a minute to type. If you have any questions, of course, please email me, david@abacusdata.ca, and I'd be happy to answer them. Well, I don't see any activity. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you have a great rest of the week and a nice weekend. And let's hope for a peaceful and smooth election day and a pretty clear result on Monday so we can get on with things. Have a great day. Thank you.